So let's start with number 1. And I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite shape animation tools, trim paths. I'm going to enter into this composition by either double clicking it here in the layer stack or coming here to my open panel. And we're going to start by creating a new shape layer. We now have a new shape layer here. Just for the sake of keeping things ordered, I'm going to actually bring my shape layer below my music layer. And I'm going to lock my music layer just so that I don't accidentally move that around. I want to be able to use that as a reference. I'm going to do one more thing here too. I've realized I've made my background a rather intense shade of green. I'm going to change that. I'm going to select my green solid and I'm going to come to the layer drop down menu and select solid settings. And well, in fact, I'm going to make it blue so it's a little easier on the eyes. So on this shapes layer that I've just created here, I'm going to come to my toolbox in the top here and I'm going to choose my ellipse tool and I'm going to click and drag out a circle. I'm just going to make it roughly around that size. I'm going to style this a little bit differently though. I'm going to take away the fill color. I'm going to click on the word fill to open up the fill options and I'm going to select none for the fill. And for the stroke, I have a white stroke around here. That's exactly what I want. And currently the stroke width is at 27 pixels. I'm going to make that 20 pixels. Let's come over to the shape layer and twirl down the disclosure triangle to reveal some of the shape layer's properties. Now we're not going to go into this in a lot of depth right now, but I just want to highlight something here. If I twirl down contents, you'll notice that there is an object here called ellipse 1. And if I twirl that down, you can see that there are some properties associated with that particular ellipse, including something that says transform ellipse 1. But we also notice that there's another transform down here. That's interesting. How come we have two different transforms? Well, as we will discover, you can have more than one shape on a shape layer. In fact, you can have many. You can control each of the shapes individually here. But as a layer, all those shapes can be controlled by the layer transforms. But to keep things simple, we are going to keep our layers to one shape per shape layer. But that'll give us more than enough options. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm going to twirl up my transforms here again. I'm going to reveal some of the properties here for ellipse 1. Some of these are very familiar to us if we've worked with Illustrator and Photoshop before. There's our stroke, there's our fill. But there's also something here called ellipse path. In a later video, we're going to talk about actually changing our path shape. But for now, we're going to leave that as it is. But I do want you to reveal the properties that make up the stroke. If I twirl that down, you can see that this is basically Illustrator's stroke panel in the layers panel with all the properties right here. And you'll notice that a number of them have stopwatches beside them, meaning that we can animate them, including this one right here, stroke width. If I click on that, you can see that I can change the width of this circle. That is one of the properties where we are going to be animating right off the bat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this back to 20. And again, I'm going to position my current time indicator right at this layer marker here. And I'm going to click once on the stopwatch for stroke width to create a keyframe for that property. The other property that we are going to be animating is the scale property. So I'm going to reveal the transforms for ellipse 1. And I'm going to click on the stopwatch for scale. Okay, I now have the two properties that I want to animate with keyframes on them. This would be a good time to reduce the amount of properties I'm currently looking at here in my shape layers by selecting that layer and pressing U on my keyboard to reveal just the properties that currently have keyframes associated with them, the stroke width and the scale property. With these keyframes here at this point, I'm going to put my current time indicator back at the beginning of my timeline. And I'm going to change my scale from 100 down to 0 so that I see that effect. Now, if I position my current time indicator right at the beginning of my timeline and press my spacebar, I can preview the very first section here. Well, it's not very dynamic at the moment. Let's put some easing on this scale property. I'm going to select those keyframes, and I want it to ease in and then hit its landing spot with some speed. That means I'm going to have to do an ease in, which is this top slider here. I'm going to drag that all the way to the right. This middle slider, I'm going to drag it almost all the way to the left. Okay, let's preview that. Still a little bit slow. I'm going to position my keyframes a little bit closer together so that I can get a little bit more pop. There we go. Now, as that shape reaches this point here in our timeline, I want the stroke width of that circle to begin to diminish. So I'm going to position my current time indicator a couple of frames beyond my last keyframe, and I'm going to change my stroke width to 0. Press enter. To see what that looks like, I'm going to position my current time indicator back at the beginning, and I'm going to press my spacebar. One last thing to do, I'm going to put some easing on these keyframes here. I'm going to add this ease in, ease out slider so that we have some easing beginning and end of that motion. It'll happen so quickly it'll be hard to detect it, but I still want to have some easing on there. There we go. So it has a little bit more of a pop as it comes off. There we go. That is going to be our first shape. We are going to duplicate that and have that play several times down our timeline. So I'm going to select that layer, and I'm going to press Command D to duplicate it, drag that down my timeline so that the layer indicator roughly begins as this cluster of beats starts coming in here. And I can see that I'm a little bit off in terms of my timing. I'm going to reveal my keyframes, and I can see that I'm a little bit off in when they're coming in. So I'm going to reposition that so that it's coming in right as that keyframe hits that marker right there. So if you recall, in my sample, the rings that come in afterwards come in on the diagonal axis of this rectangle. Let me show you what I mean. Press Command minus sign so I can zoom out just a little bit. What I want to do is reposition this duplicated layer up into the top left corner here and have a sequence of them come in on a diagonal axis. But that is a little bit tricky at the moment because I've scaled down my object to 0%, making it almost impossible to actually click on it. In order to move it, I need to position my current time indicator to a point where that layer is a little bit larger. When it's larger like that, I can now click on it and move it up to the top left like that. Let's do a couple more duplicates. I'm going to press Command D on my keyboard one more time to duplicate that layer. Again, I'm just going to move that just a couple of frames over because this one is coming in on this staccato beat here. Again, with that selected, I'm actually going to just position this into the center of my screen by coming here to Align, pressing Align Center, and Align Center that way. So you can see that I now have these come in like that. And I can see now that I did not make my circles large enough. But that's okay, because I can scale these at any time. I'm going to finish with duplicating our layers here. I'm going to press Command D with this layer one more time to duplicate that. And again, I'm going to move that down my timeline just a little bit. If I press U, I can reveal the keyframes, and I can see now that my keyframes, yes, indeed, line up with the markers. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There we go. This last circle that I've just positioned here, I'm going to make sure that I move them along my timeline so I can see it big enough that I can click on it and move it. And I'm just going to move it like that. If you want to see what that looks like. Okay. Well, that's almost what I was looking for. But again, in my original animation, my circles were larger. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all of these layers and I'm going to reveal the scale property for each of them by pressing S. Now, all of them have their scale property showing. And I'm just going to click and drag to the right so that all of these circles have now been scaled up. And you can see now, when I play this back, I get the overlap that I was looking for. Okay. Now, this next sound that comes in here, this what guitarists call a hammer-on. It's a very quick note played with a note bend. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to represent that a little bit differently. So we're going to, again, create a new shape layer by coming to the Layers drop-down menu and, again, selecting New Shape Layer. And, again, we're going to create a circle shape. I'm going to choose my circle tool, and I'm just going to click and drag while holding the Shift button down so that I can drag out a circle about that size. And again, I want to make sure that the anchor point is at the center of my shape by coming to the Motion 2 panel and clicking on the anchor point and clicking on that center proxy. And then I'm going to center the shape itself within the composition by pressing Center Horizontal and Center Vertical. Okay, now this shape, I want it coming on at this point in my timeline. I'm going to trim my layer indicator to that point right there. Now I'm going to add one of After Effects' built-in shape animators. You'll notice that when I have a shape layer selected, right next to this Contents section, if I move over to the right, there is this little button that says Add and the arrow. If I click on that arrow, this menu of options are all properties that we can add to this shape layer and animate. There's some really interesting stuff here, but there's one here that I use all the time, Trim Paths. I'm going to select this option. Trim Path is now underneath our Contents section. If I reveal the properties for that effect, you'll see that I have a few values here: start, end, and offset. What I would like you to do is take the start value and click on it and drag it to the right, and you'll see how Trim Paths really does live up to its name. What I would like to do is have this shape animate itself on and then animate itself off. So the initial state of this circle is going to be invisible. I've set both the start and end values at 100%. I'm going to click the stopwatch for both of those properties, start and end. I'm now going to move my current time indicator to just beyond this cluster of notes here, and I'm going to change my end value to 0. If I drag my current time indicator back over top of that, you can see that I now have my circle drawing in from the left. If you want it to go the other way, though, we would just have to set this up a little bit differently. I'm going to start with my values as 0 rather than 100. So click on that and make that 0. Click on that and make that 0. Now this value I'm going to change all the way to 100. And now my shape draws on from right to left. But I mentioned that I want to have this shape draw itself on and then draw itself off. So I'm also going to take this start value and drag it up to 100%. If I scrub with the current timeline indicator, though, you'll notice that we have a bit of a problem. Because those values are identical, as the line draws itself on, it's drawing itself off right away. But if we offset these keyframes by selecting these start values and dragging those to the right, you can see I can offset these values so that as that circle starts to draw itself on, it gets to a point where it starts to draw itself off as well. If you want to see what that looks like. Now, that looks okay, but let's add some easing to make this a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to select all 4 of those keyframes. And again, I'm going to come over to my Motion 2 panel, and I'm going to move this middle slider all the way to the right and this top slider down close to the left. And this may take a little bit of fiddling. I can see that it's starting to come in too quickly. I would really like that to come in much more slowly. I'm going to click on that again and make sure that that in fact has the correct. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. So it comes in slowly, eases in, picks up speed, and then eases again at the end of the animation. And you can see how that end value, by staggering these keyframes, we get that sort of effect. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this cascading set of diagonal circles, and I'm going to repeat them going along the other diagonal axis. To do that, I'm just going to click on this layer here. For me, that's called Shape Layer 4, and I'm going to duplicate that again by pressing Command D on my keyboard. Now my new shape here is called Shape Layer 6. Would be a good idea if I was naming my layers here. For the sake of time, though, I'm not going to do that, but I'll leave that up to you. So this shape layer here, I'm going to move it up to the top right corner, and I'm just going to move it along my timeline. If you want to see what that looks like, I'm going to position my current time indicator back to the start of my timeline and press the spacebar. I now have the first 4 seconds of my 8-second animation. However, the second part of my animation is exactly the same as the first. Now, I could do this in a couple of different ways. I could go back and duplicate some of the keyframes that I've got going on here, but you'll discover quickly that actually adds up to some complications. So I'm going to show you something here that is going to be very, very important. Something here that will save you a lot of time. It's how to loop an animation in After Effects. First, I want to make sure that the last circle is off the screen by the time the 4-second point comes around, because that is the point that we are going to be looping from. We just want to remember this cardinal rule of looping animations, that the first frame has to be exactly the same as the last frame of your animation. I'm going to take my layer indicators and I'm going to move them back along my timeline so that all that animation is over. Okay. Now I have the first 4 seconds of my animation. The second 4 seconds of my animation is exactly the same as the first. What I'd prefer to do is just loop this animation. Let me show you how that would be done. First of all, I need to change the duration of this current timeline. Right now, it's 8 seconds long, but the section that I want to loop is only 4 seconds long. So I'm going to take my work area indicator and move that to exactly the 4-second point. That work area is now exactly at the 4-second point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this composition to the work area by coming to the composition drop-down menu and clicking Trim Comp to Work Area. Okay. If you want to see how this loops, I'm going to again position my current time indicator at the beginning and press play. And there you go. So there is our looping animation. Let's come back to the main composition. And sure enough, our first composition, Trim Paths, appears here as a truncated layer indicator because we've changed our composition to be just 4 seconds in length. That's what we're seeing here. But we're going to add a loop effect to this composition here in the main panel. Let me show you how that's going to be done. I'm going to press my Control button while clicking on that layer to reveal this menu. And from this menu, I'm going to come to this option, Time, and choose Enable Time Remapping. And you can see what has happened here. Our layer indicator no longer is truncated. It's actually extended the entire length of our composition. But we now see these 2 keyframes here. These 2 keyframes indicate the first and the last frame of that composition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a loop effect to this second keyframe by selecting that layer, and in the layers panel, I want you to hold down your option button and click on this stopwatch for the time remap property. By holding down the option button when you click on that, you open up your expressions field. Now expressions can be a little bit scary for those people who are a little bit code phobic, but let me assure you, this is going to be easy. All we need to do is click on this little arrow right here. This is our expression menu. Now, there's a lot of options here. Don't let this freak you out. All we need to do is come to where it says property, and you'll notice that we have a couple of options here for loop. The one that we want is called loop out duration, meaning it'll just keep on looping for as long as the timeline is running. I'm going to select that, and you'll notice that our expression field here now has some new information. I'm going to click once in my composition to close that expression field, and now I'm going to place my current time indicator back at the beginning of my timeline, and I'm going to press play. Hey, it looped, but you'll notice something. If I place my current time indicator right over top of this last keyframe, my composition flashes. It just disappears for 1 frame. The reason for this, if we come back to the trim paths composition, is that if I try to take my current time indicator and position it right over top of the 4-second point, you'll notice that you can't do it. You can only ever get to the frame just before the end. Essentially, the last frame is not accessible, but we can fix this. I'm going to come back to the main. I'm going to zoom in on my timeline just a little bit so I can see this keyframe and the frames around it a bit easier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my current time indicator and I'm going to position it 1 frame back from this point here. I could just take my current time indicator and move it back one frame, or I could also use a keyboard shortcut. The Command button and the left arrow will move it back along my timeline 1 frame. Here, at this point, you'll notice that I can still see the blue of my composition. At this point, I'm going to make a new keyframe by coming here to my keyframe navigator and clicking on that little diamond to create a new keyframe right there. Now I'm going to click on this keyframe that was our blank keyframe, and I'm going to delete it. Now if I take this keyframe and position it right at the 4-second point, I now have a perfectly looping animation with no blank spots. Being able to add loops to your animations will be really important for saving you lots of time as you move forward. As we continue with these animations, we'll be doing this loop effect a few more times, just so that we get it down. In our next video, we are going to be using the pen tool to create our own custom paths here in After Effects.